The 20th century produced a weapon of mass destruction so indiscriminate that it killed millions. And it sold this lethal weapon to ordinary people. But in an effort to save lives, a science was born. It started with the pioneering work of a maverick few. Learning from half a century of mistakes and misunderstandings, they revolutionized the automobile industry and transformed a motorized monster into an engineering marvel. Crash Science, dedicated to making sure the next road trip you take won't be your last. Shortly after midnight on the 31st of August 1997, a chauffeur-driven Mercedes carrying Diana, Princess of Wales, approached the Alma Tunnel in central Paris. In pursuit were a group of motorcycle-riding paparazzi. The driver lost control of the Mercedes and collided with a central pillar, then smashed into the opposite wall. 2 occupants died at the scene, and later in hospital. So did Princess Diana. Only her bodyguard lived. But at 96 kilometers an hour, should such a crash have proved fatal? So what went wrong? Worldwide, it's estimated that over 3,000 people die in car accidents every single day. It only takes a split second for our beloved car to turn on us. But as chaotic as a crash scene appears, there are numerous clues to help specialist investigators piece together the causes from the puzzle of broken bones and twisted metal.
We see trauma from falls, from assaults, from burns, but by far and away the worst injuries are road traffic incidents. The main worrying areas of injury are injuries to the chest, injuries to the abdomen, to the pelvis and to the head.
But after a serious accident, doctors aren't the only professionals on call. Alongside the emergency services, car manufacturers often send their own teams of investigators in. They're looking at how their safety systems performed and whether the passengers were injured. Ultimately, the wreckage can end up here, on the scrap heap.
You're always conscious that you're seconds away from disaster, and that all these people were driving along perfectly content that they were the best driver in the world.
The investigators sent in by some automobile companies analyzed data from thousands of car crashes to increase the crash worthiness of their vehicles. Car safety today is a design and marketing priority, so passengers should be safer than ever. But while accidents still happen, so the story of automobile safety continues. Its key players include car company executives, scientists, advertisers, and of course the car-buying public. It all began with the groundbreaking science many of us now take for granted every time we hit the road. By the late 1800s, Britain's first horseless carriages were considered so dangerous that their speed was limited to 6.5 kilometers an hour. Citizens were surprisingly safety conscious, leading to bizarre innovations like a net designed to sweep pedestrians off their feet. This was probably the safest time to travel by car. But by the 20th century, more cars were on British roads and the speed limit was a heady 32 kilometers an hour. The safe age of motoring was already history. And automobiles were becoming big business. The selling points were gimmicks and status. And car accidents were blamed on booze, bad driving, or bad luck. The first automobile era had started in Germany during the early 1900s as cars were becoming a must-have for the rich. They consisted of little more than sheet metal nailed and screwed to a wooden frame and lacked basic features like signal lights or windshield wipers. In fact, watch what happens when one of these early cars takes a modern crash test. Pretty nasty stuff. Many features doubled as weapons. Their plate glass windshields sliced faces. Rock-hard dashboards cracked skulls. And steering wheels impaled drivers. Moreover, there were few rules of the road. The first European driving schools taught maintenance, not road safety. And it took until 1919 for the world's first stoplights to stop the traffic in Detroit. Mass production soon made the car available to a far wider market. The car became affordable, but at a heavy price. By the mid-1920s, more than 500,000 people had already been killed on America's roads. However, on the other side of the Atlantic, one small Scandinavian car maker believed that safety features ought to be considered a component of good design. In 1927, the founders of Volvo Cars, Assar Gabrielsen and Gustav Larsen, claimed that cars are driven by people. The guiding principle behind everything we make at Volvo, therefore, is and must remain safety. They focused on a design feature responsible for the most common cause of injury. Cars were fitted with primitive plate glass windshields, so even a minor crash could result in terrible facial lacerations. But even then, a solution was already out there. Back in 1903, a laboratory accident had led to the discovery of safety glass. Edouard Benedictus, a French chemist, had knocked a glass flask to the floor. It broke, but didn't shatter and splinter. It seemed the dried nitrocellulose had coated the inside with an adhesive coating, holding it together. Benedictus saw the potential for his accidental invention when he read of an automobile accident in which a young girl's face had been disfigured by flying glass. Moved by these reports, he went back to his lab and produced a sheet of celluloid adhesive between two pieces of glass. It took one particular accident for the safety glass windshield to be fitted as standard. 24 years later, in 1927, a Ford test driver was badly injured by a broken windshield, motivating Henry Ford to fit safety glass in all new Model A's. In 1918, after the end of World War I, America became the leading nation in car production. The United States possessed the technology, natural resources, and the economic strength to mass-produce cars. But then in 1929, the Wall Street crash threatened to tear the automobile industry apart. And manufacturers urgently needed a new marketing strategy. Grand design became a visual escapism from the Depression, and the car a symbol of future prosperity. Throughout World War II, the auto industry concentrated on military production. But after the war, consumer car design once again shifted into high gear. But as cars began to sell in greater numbers, so the accidents increased. By the 1950s, annual fatality rates had reached tens of thousands, and people started to think about safety. This inspired early campaigns that made drivers aware of the dangers of speed. The campaigners even turned to Hollywood, and the young star James Dean, himself a successful race car driver, to ram the safety message home.
Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. Life, you might say, might be mine.
Ironically, tragedy struck when not long after this public service announcement was made in 1955, Dean himself was involved in a car crash. Along with mechanic Rolf Weatheridge, he was en route to a race meeting in Salinas, California. They sped along Route 466 in Dean's new car, a Porsche Spyder. But as they approached the intersection, they collided with a Ford coupe coming from the opposite direction. Weatheridge was thrown clear. Dean died instantly. Many 1950s sports cars were convertibles, lacking roll bars, which weren't introduced until the 80s. In the 1950s, design was all about looks. So if you were in an accident with no seatbelt, you stood little chance. In a modern car, Dean might have survived, but not in a 1950s convertible. Although he'd only made 3 films, his premature death propelled him to legendary status. And what was left of the car went on tour. The legend had become another statistic. During the 1960s, the new freeways were changing the face of motoring. With gas, food, and lodging along every route, America hit the road. The family was on the move. But as the engines got bigger, critics of the auto companies called for smaller, more economical vehicles. And as more families now relied on cars, safety started to enter the public consciousness. The 60s would see the launch of crash science. Professor Lawrence Patrick and his assistant Bud Mertz were based at Wayne State University in Michigan. At the start of the 1960s, they were just beginning to conduct some pioneering experiments in human impact survival, the results of which changed the face of crash science forever. Bud Mertz recalls his mentor's innovative approach to research.
The work that he was involved in was that of the biomechanics, the human tolerances to impact.
And they were to be the guinea pigs. They allowed themselves to be slammed in the chest by a 10-kilo pendulum and made over 400 rides on a rapid deceleration sled that mimicked the effects of a car slamming head-on into a wall. And they filmed it all. They designed ever more ingenious ways to deliver blows to different parts of the body, devising what appeared to be more like instruments of torture than scientific apparatus.
It was a whole new science, and basically everything we did was all new.
Some experiments worked better than others. Like how much force was needed to produce different levels of bruising, painstakingly tested and recorded.
The drop test was strictly a little impactor in the tube. You laid down on the table, and the tube was over your head, and they dropped it from 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches. And everybody was walking around with little bruises on their cheek. It was sort of funny.
And their hard-earned data produced a real breakthrough. It showed that in a single car crash, there are always 3 main collisions. First is the primary vehicle impact. This is followed by the human body being thrown violently in the direction of that impact. And finally, bruising, bleeding, and pulled muscles revealed how the internal organs were also being thrown forward. This research enabled the scientists to see firsthand how the laws of physics worked on the human body. But the pain threshold was ultimately to limit the level of Bud and Patrick's research. They needed to find another volunteer, one who could bear the pain. If you lived and died in the vicinity of Wayne State University in the mid-60s and donated your body to science, your corpse may well have ended up being crash tested. The corpses were wrapped in bandages to protect their identity and to lessen the psychological effects for the researchers working with human cadavers.
Cadavers were in use at the school for the medical students, so they were available for us to look at things like the forces that bones can carry before they break.
But even the dead have their limits.
One of the problems we had is most of the cadavers are older. There is a change in the bone strength with age that we had to take into account.
The cadaver crash test program was short-lived, so to speak. It was gruesome. Wrapping each corpse took time, and each body could only be used once, or twice. Science demanded a more durable body double. The first synthetic dummies were little more than shop mannequins, with bad habits like smoking. They gave no real quantitative insight into the detail of human injury. They did, however, provide valuable clues to human injury tolerance. And the birth of the crash test dummy was to be a huge step in car safety science. But the motor industry still needed real-life data, injury criteria that related to the living body. How many pounds it took to fracture a bone, for instance. And at Wayne State, they had just that information. The crash test dummy had been designed to mimic human response and give measurements that related to injury. They were given an average male body weight and some realistic joint movements, acquired a pelvic structure and flexible spine. The latest generation are worth around $150,000 each. Despite being dummies, they're actually quite smart. In just a fraction of a second, their sensors can record over 30,000 items of data. And scientists still crash, smash, and abuse them in hundreds of different ways. Susan Yester is no dummy. She's an impact test expert at Chrysler.
This is the ATD lab. That's an anthropomorphic test device. And an ATD is a mechanical instrument that has been designed to simulate the human body.
Every body part of the dummy is tested to ensure it's performing properly. Heads are tested to make sure they'll bounce correctly in a collision. The knees are struck to test skin density, and heavy weights hit them in the chest to make sure the ribs react properly. All car manufacturers have a large collection of dummies: full-sized males, small females, different-sized children, and even babies.
Everybody's body is very different, so these are standard test devices so that we can do different types of tests in different areas. And since we know the parameters of these dummies, then we can reproduce the tests. And then we can discuss this type of data in an engineering context.
First, the dummies go to the makeup department, where they're smeared with grease paint. This allows researchers to see which parts of the dummies are hit during the crash. Then adhesive targets are applied to either side of the dummy's head. These are reference points that can be tracked in slow-motion footage. And finally, sensors are placed all over the car and the dummy's body.
We have about 60 channels in the vehicle, and these are like 60 different places or directions in which we collect data.
The duration of a typical crash is a fraction of a second, during which the sensors will simultaneously record as many as 37,200 items of data. This data is computer analyzed and translated into readouts that provide human injury parallels. But the dummy's most valuable contribution was to highlight the most important car safety feature of all time. And the most neglected. In the 1930s, several American physicians had furnished their own cars with seatbelts, urging manufacturers to do likewise. But the seatbelt was seen as something only really required for the racetrack. By the 1950s, this had developed into myth and hearsay, causing a public outcry over the dangers of seatbelts. Drivers claimed that if the car caught fire or sunk in water, the belt might be a death trap. The belief was it was better to be thrown clear in an accident than strapped in. The fact was, people didn't like them, and they looked for any excuse not to wear one. And the automobile manufacturers that did fit seatbelts were few and far between. Among those who did, Volvo were the undisputed pioneers. Their crash science specialists had already moved on from the simple lap belt because it failed to protect the head in a crash. They had refined the diagonal belt that went across the chest. But while this design prevented head injuries, it was still seriously flawed. During a crash, the body can slide under such a belt right up to the neck, causing serious injury and even decapitation. So Volvo went back to the drawing board and came up with another 3-point lap shoulder belt. Anchored firmly to the car frame, this belt worked because it restrained the two strongest parts of the body, the hips and the chest. Now the modern standard, Volvo's 3-point seatbelt system, patented in 1958, is the single most effective safety device in any vehicle. But even by the 1970s, the most powerful car industry in the world still wasn't listening. And it wasn't just about seatbelts. Despite research, so long as safety features were not selling points, car companies wouldn't install them. And even the public ignored the statistics that revealed that their cars were killers. So advertising focused on style and performance.
Front disc brakes, red line white oval tires. Want another kind of roof over your head?
Who are you?
Perhaps my optional bucket seats, power steering, air conditioning will identify me.
Aren't you the Dodge Adventurer?
My secret's out. Come on, girl. We've still got time to swing.
Then an unknown Princeton and Harvard Law School graduate called upon the government to regulate the industry. Ralph Nader went on to become an activist lawyer and presidential candidate, opposing the power of large corporations.
The most hazardous car currently in use in significant numbers in the United States.
In 1965, Nader published a controversial book that would prompt a quarter of a century of conflict. His book, Unsafe at Any Speed, claimed that General Motors were producing dangerous vehicles, ignoring research from crash safety scientists.
More likely to cause serious or fatal injury in any collision than virtually any other car in common use in this country.
General Motors hired a team to investigate Nader, who subsequently sued GM for invasion of privacy and received $425,000 in an out-of-court settlement. Then, in 1966, on the basis of research by manufacturers and crash scientists, the US Congress passed America's first auto safety laws. The most substantial automotive safety legislation in America to date. The first changes it made were fundamental improvements like headrests, energy-absorbing steering wheels, and most importantly, the mandatory installation of seatbelts. But one manufacturer was criticized for apparently choosing to put profit before safety. Ford were facing strong competition from Volkswagen and various Japanese companies in the American small car market. It usually takes around 4 years to produce a new car. But Ford took just 2 in bringing the Pinto into production. Before its release, Ford engineers had discovered a major design flaw. In some rear-end crash tests, the Pinto's fuel tank was damaged, which often resulted in an explosion and fire. But the Pinto production line had already been assembled, and Ford released the car. Ford later claimed they'd used an accepted risk-benefit analysis, but were still criticized by some for forging ahead. Finally, in 1978, Ford agreed with the Department of Transportation that it would recall the car. And there were other cars and other designs that were still causing death and injury. As cars got faster and faster, collisions became more dramatic and more deadly. On impact, they could still become horrific death traps. In 1967, one particularly high-profile accident showed just how devastating this could be. In the early hours of the 29th of June, on a stretch of Highway 90 in Louisiana, a Buick carrying Jayne Mansfield was en route to New Orleans. Visibility was extremely poor, and at approximately 7 minutes past 4, the Buick slammed into the back of a slow-moving truck. As the top of the car slid under the rear of the truck, the roof tore off, killing all 3 front occupants. Jayne Mansfield had suffered terrible, fatal head injuries. The top of her skull sliced off. Mansfield would have had a greater chance of survival in a modern car, because today's car body is engineered as a safety cage, which deflects impacting forces around the car's reinforced structure. The great misunderstanding about car safety had been that the more rigid the vehicle, the safer it was. But decades of human injuries were clearly proving otherwise. As crash science searched for ways to protect the car, it actually revealed something far more important to passenger survival. It's often true that after impact, the worse a car looks, the better off its occupants. The reason was simple. Objects in motion have energy, and it requires an opposing force to bring a moving object to rest. This can happen quickly, or it can happen slowly. Slowing down the time it takes for the opposing force to absorb that energy is the key to modern crash science. If the front and back end of a car are built to crumple, most of the impact forces are absorbed before they reach the occupants. This area of energy absorption became known as the crumple zone. Critical to survival, but it's not enough on its own.
Your car is designed to crumple on impact. Your face isn't.
Unrestrained, passengers still have a separate physical mass and energy. But seatbelts, though provided, still weren't being worn.
Like most victims, Julie knew her killer. It was her son, who wasn't wearing his seatbelt. After crushing her to death, he sat back down. Think, always wear a seatbelt.
In Britain, public safety campaigns began to drive the message home.
The biggest thing I've seen is the increased use of seatbelts over the last 15 to 20 years. If we're to look back 20 years ago, most casualty departments would have patients who would have a nurse stitching up their face all night long because they've head-butted the windscreen because they haven't been wearing a seatbelt. the patient isn't wearing a seatbelt, is ejected from the vehicle, their chances of having severe or life-threatening injuries are increased by 300%.
But on the other side of the Atlantic, this advice was ignored. By the 1980s, fewer than 25% of the American car-going public were wearing seatbelts. So new state laws and safety campaigns tried to raise public awareness, although the American version was less chilling than the British.
Okay, kids, do it! Do the buckle!
Do it! Do the buckle!
Pull it, push it, click it, that's the way. Seatbelt safety's where it's at. Today, front and back, for safety all around. Pull it, push it, click it, that's the sound.
And the ads were still only a moderate success. So the government decided to take choice out of the equation. And the scientists went back to the drawing board. They needed to develop a device that would restrain occupants in their seats, whether they liked it or not, a safety device over which people had no control. The race was on to develop the airbag, then considered to be the ultimate passive restraint. The airbag had been invented in the 1950s and even appeared in models during the 1970s. But the first airbag restraint system fitted as standard was developed by Chrysler in 1988. It was a radical step in safety. Airbag deployment is extremely violent. To be effective, it needs to inflate in a split second. Scientists explored the use of explosives like gunpowder. Engineers worked on the size of the bag, what materials to use, and how to open them 30 milliseconds after impact without blowing them apart. All of which proved difficult. Chrysler finally got it right with a thin nylon fabric packed into the steering wheel or dashboard. In a collision, the inflation force is equal to running into a brick wall at up to 25 kilometers an hour. The ignition of a rapid-burning solid propellant creates an expansion of gas, inflating the bag as it bursts from its housing at up to 320 kilometers an hour. Once fitted, airbags were saving 1,500 lives a year. But a darker side to the airbag story was about to emerge. The regulations required airbag tests to be conducted only with a dummy representing the average male, weighing approximately 72 kilos and 1 3/4 meters tall. Crash scientists were about to discover that airbags still left the most vulnerable part of the population at risk. Detonating at more than 320 kilometers an hour, they're violent enough to amputate fingers, fracture bones in the arm and face, and even kill. They're designed to hit an average man in the chest, but they may hit shorter people in the face. Grieving families set up a pressure group, forcing the car industry to post prominent warnings about the dangers airbags pose to children. And the advice was emphatic. Never seat a child in front of an airbag. But it wasn't just children that were being injured. Lighter weight adults, mostly women, were victims too. But scientists have developed a solution. Automated systems that weigh and scan passengers and then adjust the deployment pressure of the airbag. The best way to test safety features is the crash test.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The ultimate stage in the car manufacturer's safety strategy. Today, each and every model is tested to destruction. Again and again and again. Rear shunts, side impact, pedestrian impact, culminating in the head-on collision. Each and every crash test costs over $100,000. Here at Volvo's safety headquarters in Sweden, scientists crash over 400 cars a year. Every wrecked car is given a meticulous post-crash examination and then stored in a wreck depository. It takes the Volvo crash test team 6 hours to prepare a car. This one will recreate a typical and severe side impact. The stationary vehicle carries 2 occupants, a driver and front passenger. It will be hit on the passenger side by a vehicle traveling at 96 kilometers an hour. 20 high-speed cameras shooting 3,000 frames per second are mounted inside and all around the car. These high-speed cameras require powerful illumination. Each one of the 32 lights throws out 8 kilowatts of power. In fact, they're so bright that they're switched on just 5 seconds before impact. Otherwise, they'd blow. The car is wired with 200 different sensors feeding data back to the control room. It may take 6 hours to prepare a car for a crash test, but the collision is over in the blink of an eye, just 300 milliseconds. And the data takes a full 3 weeks to analyze. It's the job of Thomas Broberg to dissect the destruction of this side impact crash.
What you measure in the side impact is the acceleration of the head, forces and deflection on the chest, and forces on the pelvic and on the legs. And based on biomechanical data, there is like levels set as to how much the standard human can take.
But a crash test is still just a laboratory experiment. And sometimes a step forward in safety can reveal a whole new danger. This was made tragically clear in the late 1980s, a time when cars were protecting drivers more than ever before. And for the first time in its history, survival odds were actually on the increase. But something else was wrong. Victims of serious side impact crashes were surviving only to fall into a coma hours later, often resulting in permanent brain damage. Then human crash impact analyses revealed that while forward movement didn't result in coma, violent sideways motion did. During side impact, the 2 hemispheres of the brain are stretched across their connection. And as the neural fibers are pulled to breaking point, they become irreparably damaged, and the brain begins to swell. Coma and even death can follow. In an effort to moderate these effects, car manufacturers are now focusing on side impact protection. But they face a whole new set of challenges. They've got just 6 inches of space within which to mitigate the effects of a side impact. But they're determined to succeed. As Ingrid Skogsmo from Volvo explains.
In 1991, we introduced the side impact protection system, which is a structural system where you have a lot of load being transferred throughout the vehicle from the impacted side. If that doesn't do all the job, in 1994 Volvo introduced a side impact airbag in the seat that would blow up and protect your chest. Still, you then had the head, which needed protection. So in 1998, an inflatable curtain that falls out of the roof was invented and presented in a Volvo car.
Since 1998, all new European cars must pass a side impact crash test. These experiments in impact damage are a way of relating lab data to the real-life situations that millions of drivers face every day. Volvo's safety expert John Fredrik Gronvall is computer-linked 24 hours a day to the local emergency services called to a road accident. When there's a real-life crash, ambulances rush to the scene. And if one of the cars involved is a Volvo, John Fredrik is notified. He decides whether or not to send a forensic team out to the site to collect data from the crash. They document road conditions and take measurements. Then the car is brought into the lab for detailed examination.
Here we have a car being impacted from the side in a quite severe accident here, side impact. Because of the side impact protection system, you can see that there was enough survival space here. Even though the impact was very severe, we have this strong structural parts here that protect with a safety cage. And interiorly, the seat is being pushed sideways so that we can increase the survival space here.
The data gathered by his research team is then fed back into the crash test computers, helping to design and modify crash tests in the future.
In the laboratory, we have dummies. In real-life situations, we have real human beings. And our job is to connect dummy measurements with actual injuries.
John Fredrik and his team can now take 50 years of data and reconfigure it with newly developed software that actually creates a virtual crash test. Supercomputer simulations have made it possible to determine how a vehicle will behave in a crash more rapidly and in far greater detail. So, bringing all the results together, what have the doctors, scientists and car manufacturers concluded? How should they design the ultimate safe car? In fact, the most significant discovery has been that, as a rule, drivers are careless. Ultimately, driver error is to blame in most accidents. So the quest to develop the safest car in the world is focusing on removing control from the weakest link in automotive safety, the driver. You're about to witness how far crash safety has come. Traveling on the Autobahn at 240 kilometers an hour, the driver of the highlighted car is in serious difficulties. He grazes the guardrail on the right and loses control. As if by a miracle, he climbs out of the wreckage not only alive, but uninjured. He owes his life not to luck, but to crash science. Despite such advances, as car travel increases, the number of road deaths in many countries is also on the rise. And still, when things go wrong, people blame the roads, the weather, the car, or even fate. But hard evidence shows they're wrong. Over 90% of crashes are down to driver error. Get behind the wheel of a speed machine, and a change takes place in many people. Psychologists have discovered that the safer cars get, the faster people drive, and the more risks they take. For every extra 30 centimeters of lane width, the driver increases speed by 5 kilometers an hour. People become reckless. And this can have a dramatic impact on pedestrians. In the USA alone, 116,000 are mown down by cars every year. 6,000 of these die. Even the red light at a pedestrian crossing does not guarantee safety. So today's car manufacturers are now focusing on the safety of those both inside and outside the car. Sports cars can be a pedestrian's worst nightmare, but their streamlined looks are what sells. So Jaguar has recently revealed the world's first pyrotechnic pedestrian deployable hood, a state-of-the-art advanced safety feature. On impact, this deployable hood automatically pops up, creating a cushioning effect against the hard engine beneath, reducing injury severity. But research shows that most accidents take place when the driver hasn't seen the pedestrian, most likely at night. In response, scientists have developed the world's first intelligent night vision system. This high-tech device uses far infrared cameras to detect pedestrians in the vehicle's path and gives the driver an advance warning. But ultimately, systems like this emphasize the limitations of the human driver. And there's only so much help our cars can give us in reducing accidents. Humans make mistakes. Whereas computers are less fallible. They don't get mad, sleepy, or distracted. And they can also drive cars. The collective crash science term for these systems is active safety. Luis Moraes from Chrysler explains how computer-controlled accident prevention is significantly quicker than human reactions.
We have about 100 milliseconds or a tenth of a second to protect the occupant. All the restraints have to deploy within this time frame, and that's not going to change. So on the other hand, active safety, we have full seconds, maybe up to 10 seconds, to try and have technology assist the driver in avoiding the accident.
One example is braking systems.
We detect what the computer determines to be the intent of the driver, and it assists and enhances the ability by applying full braking force, but also detects when the driver takes the pressure completely off, and it just disengages the system.
Testing a similar system, Volvo's latest prototype features the collision mitigation system. Cameras and onboard computers calculate the distance between vehicles, their relative speeds, and their anticipated travel path to determine the likelihood of a collision.
The vehicle will brake automatically in order to mitigate this rear-end accident. So we have about 50 meters left and I'm driving 40 kph and I'm just going straight into the balloon car. And the vehicle braked automatically. We did have a collision, but as you can see, we really reduced impact speed here.
So when the car sees an impact is imminent, it warns the driver. And if that warning doesn't work, it takes control and slams on the brakes. Other human weaknesses are also treated with technology. Manufacturers are now developing a drowsiness warning system. Rear-facing onboard cameras monitor vital physical clues like blink rate. If the car suspects the driver's beginning to get drowsy, it blasts cold air at them and raises an alarm. But would all these safety features have helped save Princess Diana's life? The French investigators' conclusion was that Diana's driver was drunk, and forensic examination of the car indicated that it was traveling at no more than 96 kilometers an hour. So why did she die? Her position in the rear seat of the car, furthest from the impact, gave her the best chance of survival. But like millions who have died in car crashes before her, she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The price of automobile safety isn't just counted in the billions of dollars the industry demands, but in the millions of lives lost and still being lost right now. As you've watched this film, it's likely that over 100 people have died in car crashes, and more than half of them needlessly, since the public still doesn't demand that all safety innovations are built into every car. And the safer cars get, the more reckless drivers become. Humans will always find ways to crash cars. So if the automobiles of the future are to be made any safer, the next step in crash science may be the most radical yet, taking the human out of the driving seat and putting computers in control. But people love the personal freedom their cars give them, and tomorrow's crash scientists will need to be every bit as innovative as the pioneers before them, who've already made such huge advances in automobile safety in the past 75 years.